In a chamber lit only by the flickering glow of iron sconces, silence wasn't peace. It was anticipation. And in the center of the room sat one of history's most eloquent instruments of cruelty, the rack. Its structure was deceptively simple. A wooden frame, rollers at each end, ropes wound tight like tendons under strain. But its purpose was far more sophisticated. Not to kill. Not yet. No, the rack was built for a far more perverse aim. To unmake a person slowly, deliberately, while their mind remained fully conscious. As the wheel turned, inch by inch, arms stretched upward while legs were pulled in the opposite direction. Joints didn't shatter all at once. They popped, cracked, tore free from their sockets with excruciating clarity. Victims sometimes described the sensation as being peeled alive from the inside, their bones rebelling against the unnatural angles. And yet they lived, for a while. The Spanish Inquisition didn't want martyrs. It wanted broken minds in breathing bodies, living proof of obedience and divine fear. Imagine this. You're shackled, trembling, the cold from the stone floor radiating through your bare feet. Before you is not a torturer in shadow, but a monk in white, face serene, fingers folded. He does not scream or threaten. He gently recites scripture as he turns the wheel. For whom the Lord loveth, he chasteneth. And with each rotation, your arms are unknit from their sockets in the name of salvation. This was not punishment. It was redemption, at least that's how the Inquisition framed it. And for thousands, it was the beginning of a torment that blurred the line between body and soul, between heresy and hysteria, between man and monster. But the rack was only the beginning. The Spanish Inquisition, that unholy fusion of church and state, didn't just perfect the art of torture. It sacralized it. It transformed violence into ritual, agony into doctrine, and the destruction of human beings into an act of piety. What followed would become one of the darkest legacies in European history, not only for its violence, but for its terrifying claim that pain, when blessed by authority, could be holy. To understand the cruelty of the Spanish Inquisition, we must first understand its purpose, not to punish, but to purify. It was born not in the shadows of some dungeon, but in the gilded halls of power, under the approving gaze of monarchs and clerics who believed they were building a spiritual empire, one soul at a time, one confession at a time, one broken body at a time. The year was 1478. Spain, freshly united under Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, stood at the precipice of religious conquest. The Moors had been pushed back, and the Reconquista was nearly complete. But the enemy had changed form. It no longer wore turbans or carried scimitars. Now it sat in pews, whispered in the alleys, and worshipped behind closed doors. The enemy was internal: conversos, Moriscos, Jews who had converted outwardly to Christianity but were suspected of still practicing their old faith in secret. It was a convenient fear and a politically useful one. A heretic, after all, needed no army. Just a thought, a whisper, a doubt. And the Spanish crown, eager to centralize control, found in heresy the perfect justification for total surveillance of the soul. Thus was born the Spanish Inquisition, not as a rogue priesthood of zealots, but as a state-sanctioned machinery of religious conformity. Approved by Pope Sixtus IV but controlled directly by the monarchs, the Inquisition was a hybrid creature, half theocratic tribunal, half royal secret police. And like all institutions that weaponize faith, it cloaked its cruelty in moral superiority. Its officials, known as inquisitors, were not executioners, at least not in name. They saw themselves as shepherds, guiding the lost back to the flock. But their guidance came not through sermons or scripture. It came through interrogation, isolation, and torture, all under the premise that the accused could, and must, be saved, even if their bodies were mutilated beyond repair in the process. Confession was the goal, not truth, not justice, just agreement with the church's version of reality. And if the accused resisted, or even hesitated, the inquisitors had centuries of refined techniques to bring them to compliance. Techniques so effective they would later be studied, mimicked, and reborn in other regimes: Nazi Germany, Stalinist Russia, Pinochet's Chile. The Inquisition was, in many ways, the blueprint for the modern police state. But what made it truly terrifying was not just its reach or its methods. It was its certainty. The Inquisition believed that pain led to purity, that the soul could be beaten into grace. It viewed the scream not as a failure, but as evidence of progress. And in doing so, it fused violence and salvation into a single, seamless ideology. Victims were not told the charges against them. They were not shown the evidence. They were often not even told who had accused them. Neighbors, servants, even family members. The process was designed to break them before a single question was ever asked. Because to be accused was, in practice, to be guilty. Inside the Inquisition's chambers, the boundaries of identity began to blur. A merchant became a heretic. A healer became a witch. A woman who read scripture became a danger to the faith. And all of them, under the same flickering candlelight, would be led down a corridor of despair toward the chamber of questions, where faith was tested not by belief, but by endurance. These were not interrogations. They were liturgies of control. And the devices used were not merely tools of pain. They were symbols, physical representations of the Church's power to reshape flesh, thought, and truth. Because in the world of the Inquisition, to question authority was to question God. And God, they believed, answered through fire, steel, and silence. To imagine Inquisition torture as something chaotic or impulsive is to misunderstand its ritualized perfection. This was not the sadism of thugs in a back alley or the bloodlust of a battlefield. No, Inquisition torture was carefully staged, methodically documented, and cloaked in the dignity of legal process and divine purpose. It was theater performed for an audience of one, the institution of power itself. Before a single bone was broken, before a single scream pierced the cold air of the tribunal chambers, the accused would be led through a series of psychological calibrations designed to fracture the will. The accusation itself, whispered in Latin, conveyed without explanation, was often enough to plunge a person into dread. The accused did not know the specifics. They did not know who had spoken against them. They were simply summoned, and the walls began to close in. The first weapon was not the rack or the boot or the iron vise. It was uncertainty. This alone drove many to confession. But for those who held out, who dared to question the tribunal's sanctity, the next phase began. A slow, deliberate deconstruction of the self. Before formal questioning, the accused was often taken into the torture chamber, not to be tortured, but to see, to smell, to listen. Iron tools arranged on polished tables. Hooks, screws, wedges. Ropes stretched taut across rollers. A brazier glowing softly in the shadows, embers waiting to be stirred. And then, the gentle voice of the Inquisitor. Do you persist in your denial? This was the moment many broke. Not from pain, but from anticipation. Those who didn't would be read a statement, a declaration that torture would now be used, sanctioned by both church and state, for the purpose of discovering truth. The paradox was baked into the language. Torture was not punishment. They insisted. It was a tool of salvation, a necessary discomfort for the greater good. Torture was often administered not in secret, but in front of official notaries who recorded the victim's words as their joints dislocated, as their flesh split. Every confession, every scream was transcribed, not to preserve justice, but to protect the system that enacted it. And if a victim confessed under torture, that was not enough. They were required to repeat their confession the next day, without coercion, to verify its truth. If they recanted, the torture resumed, often with greater severity. This created a cruel paradox. To survive, you had to lie, but to be believed, you had to lie convincingly after your body had been destroyed. Some were told that if they confessed, they would be spared death. This too was often a lie. Others were promised leniency if they named co-conspirators. Entire communities collapsed into betrayal, each person naming another in the desperate hope of survival. In this way, torture didn't just destroy individuals, it corroded the social fabric, turning friend against friend, family against family. And always, the rituals continued. Prayers were said before and after torture. The inquisitors wore clerical robes, their hands steady, their voices calm. They were not monsters, they insisted. They were doctors of the soul, extracting disease from the flesh. But the flesh, of course, suffered. The screams, muffled behind thick stone walls or echoing through the corridors of monasteries, became a kind of background noise to the work of purification. And in time, even those screams became normalized. Pain was no longer a warning sign. It was proof that the system was working. And so the theater continued, day after day, decade after decade. Because to the Inquisition, torture was not a spectacle of violence. It was a sacred performance. A ceremony in which the body was unmade and remade according to the doctrine of absolute obedience. The truth didn't matter. Only compliance did. Among all the tools of the Inquisition, none was more iconic, more devastatingly effective, or more symbolically potent than the rack. It was not a complicated machine. For posts, a central frame, rollers at each end. But this crude simplicity only masked its true function, to stretch the human body until it came apart at its seams. Victims were tied by the wrists and ankles, secured to rotating spindles operated by torturers whose hands moved slowly, deliberately, sometimes with prayers on their lips. The purpose was never immediate pain. It was transformation, to take a person and reduce them to their weakest, most terrified essence, pulled literally apart by the contradiction of faith and fear. With each turn of the wheel, bones creaked and ligaments strained. The body did not rupture in a moment, it surrendered in increments. Shoulders dislocated first, then hips, elbows unhinged, tendons tore from the bone. The chest stretched until breathing became gasping, the diaphragm confused, spasming without rhythm. And yet, the rack was carefully measured. Most victims were not allowed to die, not yet. Death was considered a failure of the process. The aim was to prolong suffering, to push the boundary of endurance until confession became not just possible, but inevitable. Accounts from the period describe victims whose limbs were lengthened by 6 inches or more, their arms flailing uselessly, their sockets empty hollows, their hands twitching like broken spiders. Often, bones would shatter from sheer pressure. In some cases, the spine curved unnaturally, snapping like a bowstring under tension. But the most insidious aspect of the rack wasn't the physical agony. It was the way it fractured time. A minute on the rack felt like eternity. Victims lost all sense of past or future. They existed only in the moment of the next pull, the next pop, the next twist. Their world became sound. The grind of wood, the hiss of breath, the low murmur of monks reading from scripture. This disorientation, this unraveling of temporal reality, was just as deliberate as the dislocation of joints. The rack was not just a tool of punishment. It was a tool of deconstruction. Its purpose was to erase the person who had entered the chamber, their defiance, their memory, their pride, and leave behind something else, a compliant voice in a ruined body. And even those who survived the rack were not truly free. They carried its signature with them for the rest of their lives. Arms that no longer lifted, legs that no longer supported, backs that curved unnaturally, voices that trembled when they spoke the words they had been forced to confess. Perhaps the most disturbing irony was that the confession recorded under such duress was considered valid. A man whose elbows hung loose and shoulders rotated unnaturally was expected to speak clearly, to affirm his guilt in front of tribunal clerks, to remember what he'd been told to say, all while every nerve in his body screamed in betrayal. Some historians have argued that the rack, while horrifying, was no worse than the battlefield or the gallows. But this misses the point entirely. Those deaths were honest in their violence. The rack pretended to be holy, pretended to heal. There is a recorded case from 1588 in Seville, where a suspected crypto-Jew, a man named Diego Rodriguez, was racked until he confessed to observing the Sabbath. His limbs were torn, his voice distorted by pain, and yet when he tried to retract his confession the next day, citing coercion, he was racked again, this time until unconsciousness. He died not from bleeding, but from organ collapse. His confession remained on record. The Inquisition recorded the event not as a failure, but as a successful purification. This is the most chilling truth about the rack, that it worked, that it broke people in precisely the way the Inquisition intended. Not just physically, but existentially. Turned truth into ash and obedience into virtue. And when it was done, the tools were cleaned, the wood wiped down, the ropes coiled, the chamber swept, and the next body was brought in. If the rack tore the body apart with spectacle, the iron boot and Spanish chair achieved their purpose through quiet, contained devastation. These were not devices meant to shock an audience. They were designed to leave minimal visible wounds while maximizing the agony coursing through nerves and bones. The Inquisition understood that a clean surface hid a ruined interior, and in these tools were masterpieces of concealed brutality. The iron boot was a simple mechanism, a metal casing locked around the lower leg, from knee to foot. But once secured, it became a chamber of horror. The torturer would insert wooden wedges between the boot and the prisoner's shin. These wedges were then hammered in, one by one, each blow driving the metal deeper into the flesh, cracking tibia and fibula, splintering bone against bone. The pressure was relentless and focused. Unlike the rack, which dispersed agony across the whole body, the iron boot concentrated pain in one limb, ensuring that every nerve ending screamed in isolation. With each strike, the victim's leg didn't just break, it shattered internally. Blood vessels burst beneath the skin, tissue compressed, and often the bones would split lengthwise, curling outward in unnatural directions. In some cases, the skin remained mostly intact, even as bone fragments tore muscle from within. This lack of external damage gave the torturers a grotesque advantage: the appearance of mercy, even while inflicting suffering that rendered walking impossible for life. Inquisitors could claim, and did, that they had not drawn blood. But they didn't need to. They had turned bone to gravel inside the leg of a man who had dared question church doctrine, or who had been accused of reading the Torah in his cellar, or who had remained silent when asked if his neighbor fasted on Fridays. And the records, because there were always records, stated that the confession came freely and under God. Where the boot crushed, the Spanish chair burned. A high-backed iron seat fitted with straps, locks, and heating channels, the chair was deceptively elegant. Some versions were carved with crosses. Others featured inscriptions from scripture, as though pain itself were a liturgical practice. The prisoner was placed in the chair, arms, legs, torso bound tight, and the metal was heated slowly from beneath with burning coals or braziers. The heat rose through the iron, not quickly enough to burn skin immediately, but gradually enough to draw sweat, panic, and screams before the searing even began. By the time the chair became scorching, there was no escape. The iron clung to the flesh. Victims writhed and screamed, but the straps held. Skin blistered, muscle cooked. The smell of seared human fat filled the room, a stench so thick and choking it clung to the robes of the interrogators. The chair's greatest cruelty was that it did not always kill. In some sessions, the fire would be kept low, just enough to cause third-degree burns, to destroy nerve endings and leave permanent scars, not just as punishment but as branding. A way to show the world what happens when faith is questioned. One notorious case from 1602 involved a Morisco woman in Valencia, accused of secret Islamic practices. She was strapped into the Spanish chair for nearly 2 hours, her legs charred down to the muscle. When the straps were finally removed, her skin came with them. Her screams reportedly echoed through the monastery for the rest of the night. She survived technically. She confessed. She was sentenced to life in prison, unable to walk, sit, or lie down without agony. The Inquisition deemed the case a success. Like the rack, these devices were designed not just to destroy, but to send a message: obedience or obliteration. Not death, not always. Death was too easy. True punishment was to live with what they had done to you, to exist as proof, limping, maimed, disfigured, that the church could reach not only into your mind but into your marrow. The iron boot, the Spanish chair, they were not chaotic instruments of a bloodthirsty regime. They were precision-engineered expressions of holy domination, made by blacksmiths under the commission of bishops, tested, improved, and sanctified. And when they cooled, when the flesh stopped smoking and the bones stopped breaking, the chair and the boot were cleaned, stored, and readied for the next soul in need of correction. because cruelty in the Inquisition's hands was not an act of rage. It was a sacrament. Some torture devices rely on spectacle, others rely on sound. But the pair of anguish was designed to work in secrecy, a device so intimate, so targeted, that it didn't just cause pain. It humiliated, it violated, and above all, it ensured silence because no one who survived it would speak of it easily again. At first glance, the pair of anguish seemed harmless, small enough to fit in a hand, shaped like a metal fruit with petal-like segments and a central screw. But its size was deceptive. Inserted into the mouth, the rectum, or the vagina, depending on the accusation and gender of the victim, the device was then slowly opened using the screw mechanism, each turn forcing the petals outward, expanding the pair inside the most sensitive parts of the human body. The result was not only excruciating pain, but often permanent internal damage, hemorrhaging, and in some cases, death from infection or organ rupture. In the mouth, it shattered teeth and dislocated jaws, tearing at the flesh of the cheeks and throat. But in the lower body, the damage was far worse. Inserted vaginally or anally, the pair ripped delicate tissue, caused uncontrollable bleeding, and left survivors with lifelong incontinence, infertility, and trauma too profound for words. Victims weren't just hurt, they were silenced both literally and symbolically. The device was commonly used on women accused of witchcraft, sexual deviance, or blasphemy, especially those who spoke too much, questioned male authority, or defied the church's expectations of obedience and submission. It was, in every way, a weapon of misogyny, sexual violence sanctified by theology. The Inquisition never formally listed the pair in its official instruments of torture. It was often unofficial, a tool of discretion used in convents, confessionals, and secret interrogations where shame was just as useful as pain. It left few external marks. That was the point. A victim might walk again. They might even smile, but they would never speak the same way, move the same way, or look at their accusers without the shadow of what had been done to them. One case, preserved in the notarial archives of Toledo, tells of a young woman named Maria Lopez, accused of seducing a priest through ungodly charms. She denied the charge, repeatedly. She was 19, and when her voice would not yield to pressure or threat, they used the pair. Afterward, she could no longer walk without pain. She never married. She never spoke of the priest again. Her silence was catalogued as a success. The church moved on. This is what made the pair of anguish uniquely horrifying among the Inquisition's arsenal. It targeted not the body in general, but the body's most private sanctums. Punished not crime, but perceived impurity. It was not a device of state control, it was a device of moral colonization. An invasion dressed as correction. And unlike the rack or the boot, the pair left no scars for others to see. No public wounds. Just private ruin carried quietly, sometimes for decades. Survivors did not write about it. They didn't warn others, because who could speak of what had happened? Who would listen? And even if they did, the tribunal records would say otherwise. That she was questioned, that she recanted, that she repented. The pair of anguish was not just a device. It was an idea made metal, that pain could be invisible, that truth could be extracted through shame, and that even the deepest violations could be made righteous if committed in God's name. In the hands of the Inquisition, the body was not sacred. It was terrain to be conquered, and the pair was the blade that cut from the inside out.